I am.
There is a paradox hidden inside the most sacred human gesture. When a person prays from the posture of need, they believe they are reaching toward the divine. Yet the invisible architecture beneath that prayer may be doing the opposite. It may be locking consciousness into the very reality it is begging to escape. Because the universe does not only hear words, it reads orientation, it reads assumption, it reads the metaphysics of your inner position. So if your prayer is secretly structured as, I do not have, I am not safe, I am not worthy, power is outside of me, then the ritual, however sincere, becomes a confirmation loop. And here is the great inversion. What if much of what we call prayer is not communion, but compliance, a subtle spiritual technology, inherited from systems, designed to keep the soul negotiating with an external throne? Not because the divine is cruel, but because consciousness is precise. It manifests what you are positioned as, more reliably than what you ask for. In today's transmission, we're going to step beyond the veil of supplication and examine what I call the architecture of inevitability, the inner design where reality begins to move as if it must. Not because you begged for it, but because your consciousness finally aligned with what was always true. We'll explore the prolegomenon, the great inversion, the esoteric thesis that traditional prayer, as it is commonly practiced, can function as a mechanism of control, reinforcing the illusion of separation, training the nervous system into a state of lack, and outsourcing authority to an imagined distance between you and source. But we will not stop at critique. We're going to replace it with a higher framework, one found across mystical lineages, occult philosophy, depth psychology, and consciousness studies. A framework where prayer evolves into something more dangerous, more liberated and more true, not asking, assuming, not pleading, aligning, not reaching outward, remembering inward. By the end of this video, you will understand how to detect the subtle lack code hidden in your spiritual language, and how to reconfigure your inner ritual so reality begins to respond not to your desperation, but to your inevitability. From an academic lens, what we call religious posture is rarely neutral. It is embodied pedagogy, a curriculum written into muscle memory. To kneel, to bow the head, to clasp the hands, to wait. These gestures can be beautiful when they arise from reverence, but when they are culturally engineered into the masses as the default stance of spirituality, they perform a subtle social function. They train passivity. Because the body is not simply expressing belief, it is rehearsing a relationship to power. And when an entire society is conditioned to approach the unseen through begging, it produces a predictable psychological outcome. A population habituated to external authority, dependent on permission, and quietly convinced that the real levers of reality are held elsewhere. In the language of sociology, it is governance through ritual. In the language of psychology, it is learned helplessness with sacred aesthetics. And in the language of esoteric philosophy, it is the maintenance of the illusion of separation, the sense that you must petition a distant throne to receive what is already structurally available through alignment. Now, let's state the uncomfortable truth that mystics whisper and institutions rarely tolerate. Those who truly govern outcomes, whether you call them the 1%, the initiates, the strategists, the architects, do not live in a constant posture of pleading. They do not send fragile hopes into the void and wait anxiously for a reply. They shape reality from within, through assumption, structure, and certainty, not because they are spiritually superior, but because they have learned a principle. The masses are discouraged from mastering. Reality obeys the dominant state. It organizes itself around the deepest conviction, not the loudest request. And that is why the elite mind, whether in finance, politics, media, or influence, operates like a ritualist. It speaks in forecasts that become directives. It builds environments that generate behavior. It frames narratives until the public confuses suggestion for truth. Even at the mundane level, the pattern is clear. They do not ask life for permission. They assume they are authorized, then build the world that matches that assumption. So the central initiation here is not manifestation tricks. It is a change in posture, a change in metaphysical grammar, because asking often affirms absence. It subtly declares, I do not have. I am not there. I am not it. But knowing affirms presence. It declares, I am already connected. I am already in alignment. The source is not elsewhere. It is here, as my own interior foundation. This is the shift from supplication to sovereignty. From Mike, please give me, to, I recognize what is already true, and I inhabit it. From, one day I will become, to, I now stabilize the identity that reality must reflect. And this is where the Architecture of Inevitability becomes more than a poetic title. When you stop asking as if you are outside the door and start knowing as if you were always inside the house, reality begins to reorganize itself around your presence, not instantly, not magically, but inevitably, because your consciousness is no longer broadcasting lack. It is broadcasting authorization. Now we arrive at a Hermetic distinction so subtle most people miss it. Yet it governs outcomes with brutal consistency. Aspiration is wanting, assumption is inhabiting. And reality, whether you interpret it through mysticism, psychology, or systems theory, tends to organize itself around the latter. The law of assumption, in its simplest form, is not wish fulfillment. It is ontological alignment. Reality conforms not to your wishes, but to your certainty, because certainty is a signal of what you already accept as real. A wish is a request issued from a worldview that still doubts. Certainty is a command emitted from a worldview that has already decided. In esoteric terms, the astral responds to impressions, not petitions. In psychological terms, the nervous system obeys expectation more than intention. In practical terms, what you repeatedly assume becomes the template your choices, perceptions, risks, and tolerances unconsciously serve. This is why those who operate at the level of power do something the masses are rarely taught. They do not pursue wealth as though it is a distant object. They embody wealth as an identity state before it appears as a number, meaning they stabilize the inner posture that makes wealth logical. They think in terms of ownership rather than wages. They speak in terms of assets rather than effort. They build environments where money becomes a consequence, not a goal. To the untrained eye, it looks like confidence. To the trained eye, it is identity engineering. They don't chase the world. They become the kind of person for whom the world reorganizes. Now let's be precise, because physics is often invoked carelessly in spiritual spaces. This isn't physics in the literal sense of breaking the laws of nature. It's a physics-style model, a way of describing how systems behave when a dominant state becomes stable. Certainty functions like a field, a cohering force that reduces internal contradiction. And when contradiction drops, action becomes clean. Choices become immediate. Signals become consistent. Social reality responds faster because humans and institutions respond to coherence more predictably than to hesitation. So the hack isn't that you magically bend atoms with belief. The hack is that certainty collapses indecision. And indecision is the true time tax on manifestation. Effort without certainty is friction. Effort with certainty becomes leverage. This is where the elite invert the familiar causal chain. The traditional model taught to the masses is work, have be. If I work hard, I will have it. And then I will finally become it. But the inverted model, the one quietly used by initiates of power, is be, do, have, or in your phrasing, embody, manifest. They choose the identity first. Be, they stabilize the internal state first. They behave as if the outcome is already structurally true. Then reality begins to comply, because their behavior becomes a consistent proof. This is the hidden engine behind inevitability. When you embody the frequency of the outcome, you no longer move like someone hoping. You move like someone authorized. And the world, socially, psychologically, materially, responds to authorization faster than it responds to desperation. Here is where the conversation becomes less inspirational and more operational. Because power, in its most functional definition, is not random, it is ritualized. And by ritual, I do not mean candles and costumes, though those can be part of it. I mean something more fundamental. A ritual is pattern made intentional. A ritual is repetition with precision. A ritual is a behavior so consistent it begins to function like law inside the psyche. The universe, whether you interpret it as God, field, simulation, psyche, or probability, responds most reliably to what is stable. Not what is loud, not what is dramatic, but what is repeated, patterned, and precisely assumed. This is why desperation rarely manifests miracles. It's chaotic. And why ritual often manifests outcomes. It's coherent. Ritual takes a desired state and gives it rhythm. And rhythm is the language the subconscious understands. Because the subconscious does not argue with theology. It obeys consistent instruction. Now watch this. Most people talk to reality as if reality is a debate. They negotiate with circumstances. They bargain with timing, they plead with probability. But ritual is not negotiation. Ritual is programming. It conditions the inner system to obey commands rather than react to appearances. When you ritualize your intention, you are training your subconscious with 3 things it cannot ignore. Repetition, which makes the instruction dominant. Emotion, which gives the instruction gravity. Precision, which reduces internal contradiction. This is the true purpose of spiritual discipline across traditions. Not to impress heaven, but to impress the subconscious. To carve an inner groove so deep the mind stops asking, "Is this possible?" and starts behaving as if this is already underway. And when the subconscious stops questioning, the outer life stops delaying. And this is where the ancient world becomes startlingly relevant. Because the initiates of old understood something modern people half remember as superstition, but which was originally a technology, timing as a force. They used symbols not as decoration, but as keys compressed, meaning that speaks directly to the subconscious and the deep imagination. They use numbers as patterns, numerology as a way of structuring attention and intent, through symbolic mathematics. And they tracked planetary cycles not simply to predict weather or seasons, but to synchronize action with larger rhythms, what we might call cosmic phase locking. Whether you interpret astrology literally, metaphorically, or psychologically, the principle remains. When your action is timed with a rhythm larger than your mood, it gains momentum. That is cosmic precision, not waiting for motivation, but moving when the pattern is aligned. Because in this model, reality is not persuaded by hope. Reality is shaped by repetition, structure, and timing. By the ritualization of your inner state until the external world has no choice but to reflect the pattern. You have stabilized. If ritual is the pattern that trains reality, then language is the code that gives the pattern its instructions. Across esoteric traditions, the logos is not merely speech. It is the principle that reality is structured through articulation, through naming, declaring, defining, and even if we approach this academically, the implication is the same. Language does not only describe your world. Language selects your world. It shapes what you notice, what you expect, what you tolerate, what you pursue, and therefore what becomes statistically inevitable in your life. Every syllable you repeatedly speak becomes a small architectural decision, not because words are magic in a cartoon sense, but because words are mental, instructions wrapped in sound. They shape internal posture. They encode identity. They establish boundaries. And boundaries are the most important invisible technology in human experience. What you define as possible, normal, me, not me, allowed, forbidden, becomes the container reality pours itself into. This is why language has always been a site of power. To rename something is to regovern it. To frame an event is to control its meaning. To declare an identity is to set the parameters reality will mirror. Notice the linguistic difference between someone who is manifesting by pleading and someone who is shaping by assumption. The posture of lack speaks like this: I hope it works out. Maybe one day, if I'm lucky. I'm trying. But the posture of sovereignty speaks like a decree. I decide. I move with precision. This is already unfolding. I always win. Now, understand what's happening beneath the words. I hope is a confession of uncertainty. It tells the subconscious, prepare for disappointment, keep the heart guarded. I am is a stabilizing statement. It tells the subconscious, organize behavior around this identity. The powerful do not simply speak optimism, they speak finality. Not arrogance, not delusion, finality, because the subconscious obeys, the identity that sounds finished. This is where the tragedy becomes obvious. The average person is not failing because they don't pray enough or work enough. They are failing because they are unknowingly casting spells against themselves all day long, not in some theatrical occult sense, but in the quiet daily way. Language programs expectation. Think of the common phrases people repeat. I can't afford this. That never works for me. I'm just not good at that. People always let me down. Money is hard to come by. Each phrase is not just an opinion, it is a contract, and the subconscious is painfully loyal. It will organize your perceptions, decisions, and opportunities to remain consistent with the contract you keep reciting. So you can light candles at night. But if your daytime language is defeat-coded, your ritual is being canceled out by a stronger, more frequent program. Words are not only communication, they are boundaries of existence. They mark the edges of what you will attempt, accept, and become. And here's the central warning. If you do not design your script, someone else will. Culture will hand you a vocabulary of limitation. Family history will hand you a grammar of fear. Society will hand you realism that is actually a subtle form of obedience. But the initiate understands. To revise your life, you must revise your language. Because your tongue is not simply speaking about your reality, it is continually voting for which reality gets to stay. So the logos becomes a sovereign tool. Not affirmations as decoration, but declaration as architecture. Not positive thinking, but authoritative speech that trains your subconscious to behave as if your chosen state is already law. And once the inner law is stable, the outer world begins to negotiate less and comply more. Now we enter what I will call the apocryphal layer. Not secret history in a sensational sense, but the shadow text of civilization. The knowledge that exists at the edges of what institutions are willing to teach. Consider this academically. Institutions do not merely transmit knowledge, they curate it. Schools, religions, and cultural systems are designed to produce coherence, predictability, and continuity. And because of that, they often favor teachings that reinforce stable identities, protect existing hierarchies, and minimize existential volatility. So what gets emphasized? Moral instruction, social obedience, external authority, and what tends to be minimized or simplified into metaphor. The mechanics of reality as lived technology, how attention shapes experience, how identity becomes destiny, how belief becomes perception, how language becomes constraint, how ritual becomes conditioning, not necessarily because every teacher is malicious, but because a population trained in inner sovereignty is harder to manage. Through fear, scarcity, and dependency. That is the veil, not pure deception, but selective education. Across history, certain forms of wisdom show up again and again, then reappear later under new names. In mystery schools and initiatory traditions, in Hermetic and esoteric philosophy, in contemplative practices, in mythic codes that function like psychological technologies. But as these teachings move into mass culture, something often happens. They get diluted. The operative becomes symbolic. The experiential becomes doctrinal. The inner method becomes a moral story. So when people say forbidden knowledge, one grounded way to understand it is this. Not that truth vanished, but that it was domesticated. Trimmed of its power to produce independent minds, reshaped into something safe, respectable, and non-disruptive. And here is the uncomfortable implication. The one that makes this segment feel dangerous. If large numbers of people genuinely understood how to stabilize their inner state, refine their language, govern their nervous system, and direct attention with precision, many of the current structures that rely on mass insecurity would weaken, because so much social control is not enforced by chains. It's enforced by self-concept. A person who believes they are small will accept smallness. A person trained to plead will tolerate delay. A person convinced power lives out there will keep outsourcing authority. But a person who learns to command energy, in the practical sense of regulating emotion, concentrating intention, and maintaining coherence, stops being easy to steer with manufactured fear. That doesn't mean society collapses overnight like a movie. It means the spell breaks. And when the spell breaks, people renegotiate everything. What they accept, what they purchase, what they consent to, what they work for, and what they believe they deserve. So the apocryphal thesis is not simply they hid it from you. It's more precise. They taught you what to believe, but often avoided teaching you how belief becomes reality. And that omission, intentional or structural, has consequences. Because once you learn the mechanics, you stop being a petitioner in life's temple, and you become a practitioner. And now we arrive at the only conclusion that matters, because every revelation is meaningless unless it returns you to your own center. The sovereign realization is not that the world is against you. It is that your power was buried under misdirection. Layer by layer, the posture of pleading, the habit of waiting, the language of lack, the negotiation with circumstance, the outsourcing of authority to systems that benefit when you doubt yourself. But beneath all of that, something remained untouched. Not your ego, your origin. The part of you that does not beg, because it knows. The part of you that does not chase, because it aligns. The part of you that does not collapse, because it remembers what it is. And the moment you reclaim that inner seat, the entire geometry of your life changes. So let's compress the thesis into its simplest, sharpest form. Asking from lack reinforces lack. Certainty imprints faster than wishing. Power is ritualized. Repetition and precision train the subconscious. Words are spells. Your language becomes your limits or your liberation. Institutions often omit the mechanics of reality, because sovereign people are harder to steer. And therefore, the architecture of inevitability is the practice of becoming so internally coherent through identity, ritual, language, and alignment that reality begins to respond as if it must. Not because you pleaded harder, because you finally stood where the answer lives. So now the curtain has been pulled back. Not to make you paranoid, but to make you precise. Not to make you angry, but to make you awake. And the final question is not theoretical. It is personal. Now that you can see the mechanism, who will write the next chapter of your reality? The old version of you waiting for permission, or the reclaimed self writing in sovereign ink? If this message resonated, don't let it remain a moment of inspiration. Turn it into a decision. Comment "I am" if you're choosing the posture of sovereignty over supplication. Like this video so this teaching reaches the ones who are ready. Subscribe if you haven't already, because in the next episode, we'll turn this philosophy into a practical protocol, language, ritual, and timing so you can actually apply it. And share this with someone who's still praying like a prisoner. Because the most radical spiritual act is not begging for freedom. It's remembering you were never powerless. And remember, your awakening is part of the collective unfolding. Until next time, Universal Consciousness signing out.